So in South Africa, colored, and that was a thing I had to learn when I came to the US. I mean, I remember when I first came here, every time I'd say colored, people would look at me like I just escaped like a slave novel or something, you know? And I always had to explain to people that where I'm from, this skin tone is known as colored. In South Africa, they essentially created a race that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. And it's not just a race, it's a culture. The people speak with a different accent, they have a different dialect and a language, and it's a completely different world, an area that is only populated by people who look exactly like me. And that is generations of people where they can almost not trace themselves back to a black or white person, you know, because every time that this crime was committed, they would take the child of that crime, and then that child would be sent off to an orphanage, and they slowly grew these communities of colored people. But in my world, because I was never taken away from my parents, because I was never forced to live in a community that I didn't belong to, I grew up as black. You know, I only know the black experience. I only know how to be an African. So as much as people wanted to call me colored, because colored is a culture in South Africa, I realized at a very young age, and I read about that in the book, that I was indeed black. Basically, growing up in South Africa during the time that I grew up in, one of the biggest rules was that black and white people weren't allowed to freely associate. And this meant in all shapes and forms, you know, all the way through, you know, from just casual interactions to sexual interactions. And my parents obviously broke these rules, but there was a price to pay. And one of those prices was that we couldn't be a normal family. But my mom insisted that we try. So, you know, we would go out together, and one of the days in particular I remember was we went out to Joburg Park, which is basically the central park of Johannesburg. You know, it's big, giant trees and a little lake in the middle of it, and there's chessboard pieces, you know, the human-sized chess pieces that you can move around. And we went there together, and my dad was walking ahead of us so as not to seem like he was part of the family. And my mom was walking with me, and she would act like she was looking after the child that was colored, and she was the maid. And I saw my dad, and so I started running after him, you know, and I was like, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy," and I chased him, and he couldn't have me come to him, so he ran away. And so I thought, well, the game is on. And so I chased him, and so my mother chased me to stop me from chasing him. And in my head, I was a child having a wonderful day at the park with my parents, and they were terrified because I was threatening our livelihoods. But that's what we did, you know. And if we weren't with my dad, my mom realized very quickly how you could break the rules of a nonsensical regime. And since it was all broken down by color, appearances are everything, because that's really what color and race is. It's just an appearance. So what my mom would do sometimes is, if the police were cracking down in the city, is she would get a friend of hers who lived in our building, a woman named Queen. And Queen was a colored woman. And so Queen looked very similar to me. And what my mom would do is, we would go out with Queen into the streets, and my mom would walk behind us dressed as a maid, and she would make it appear as if she works for this colored family. And I would walk and hold hands with Queen, and I would look like I'm Queen's child. And I have pictures of me as a child where I'm walking with Queen in the streets, and it looks like she's my mom. And then there's this woman in the background who's photobombing all the pictures, and that's my mom. You know, and we tried and we used every single tool we could to navigate this system. And my mom, stubborn and defiant as she was, even if she couldn't have Queen, if the police were still out and she wanted to take me out for a walk, she would. And she would just walk with me as a maid and act like, you know, she was my caregiver, not my mom. And if the police showed up, then she would just drop my hand and act like I wasn't hers. I always said I felt like a bag of weed. That was one of the greatest gifts my mother gave me. I always tell people that's what I encourage every parent gives their child, is knowledge. And not just knowledge that you get from books, not just information, but knowledge. My mother imparted on me the knowledge that there was more than what we had. There was more than what we were told we were allowed to have. And so my mom made it her mission to take me into places and spaces that I didn't belong. Take me into places that I would never see. There was a chance I was never going to see this in the future. There was no end in sight for us. There was no idea that apartheid was going to end. And what we'd do is, on random weekends, my mom would drive me, we'd come back from church, we'd be driving back to where we lived, which was way on the outskirts, and we would drive through rich white neighborhoods. And my mom would stop the car, and then we'd just look at people's houses, and they had giant walls and you could never see over them at these estates. And so my mom would lift me onto her shoulders like a little periscope, and I would look over the wall and I would just describe everything I could see. I'd be like, they have a swimming pool, and there's dogs, and there's a car, and there's a double-story house, and there's and I would just tell her the story, just describe this world that I saw. And what was powerful about that for me was the fact that there were many kids who grew up in my neighborhood who never knew of these things. They didn't know you could have a swimming pool in your house. They didn't even know what a swimming pool was. They didn't know of tennis courts. They didn't know that some people could have a driveway in their house. I remember how that blew my mind the first time I saw it. I was like, they've got a road inside their house. It just blew my mind. And that's what my mom did. She took me into spaces that I didn't have access to. And I think the importance of that was, and I appreciate that today, is people often say to me, they go, did you have a dream that you would be where you are today? And I say no. I say no, because my imagination didn't stretch this far, And sometimes when people say follow your dreams, I go, that's slightly limiting depending on where you're from, because you can only dream of what you can imagine. And sometimes your imagination is limited by the confines of your world. So there are many kids in Africa growing up who don't dream of being an astronaut, and it's not because they're not aspirational, it's because they've never been shown that the man can go into space. They've never been shown that possibility. And I think just by showing me that world, my mom gave me the ability to imagine one day going into that world. When I was growing up, my grandmother was extremely protective of me, because were I to be spotted by the police in Soweto, a black area, I would be taken away, right? The police would confiscate me from my parents, send me off to an orphanage, because they did not want any mixing of any blood which could throw off the status quo of their regime. So my grandmother guarded me, with life and limb. She tells me stories of how I used to dig a hole under the gate to escape, like a little dog. She would lock all the gates, and she'd find this little hole, and I'd be gone, and she'd be chasing me down the street, and at every corner someone would just be pointing, because they all knew her and they all knew me, and I was the only person that she could be looking for, and I was the only person who looked like me in my neighborhood. So you just saw this little light-skinned child running in a sea of black people, and everyone was like, yep, it's that way. But she was extremely protective, and she was that way because she didn't want to lose me. And I didn't know this at that age. I just thought she was protective because she was a grandmother and she didn't want a child going outside. So I stayed indoors, and I would read, and I would hang out, and I'd be good at being by myself, and I'm still great at that. And what's wonderful about it is, I guess because of the escape of books. I always tell people go, it must have been horrible, you're in the house. I'm like, no, I was everywhere in the world. I spent summers in Narnia. I traveled to, the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I was in England. I've been everywhere, and I took solace in books. And the way that served me, and the way that continues to serve me, is when you're good at being by yourself, you sometimes just get to watch the flow of people around you. You get to sit in a corner, and because you're not preoccupied with going with the flow or with the pack, you monitor what's happening. You see it. You almost view life like a nature documentary. You just sit down the side like David Attenborough, and you just watch the watering hole, and you get to comment on it on your mind. And I still use that till this day. So I enjoy company. I love hanging out with people, but you will never hear me say the phrase, I'm alone. I always just say, I'm by myself. My mom was never bitter. My mom always bounced back. My mom never minimized the pain or suffering that we were experiencing, but she didn't believe in letting that define her. She didn't believe in letting herself be defined by that experience. I remember there's a trait that I learned from my mom, which I still use till this day, and that is people would, when we'd be driving or walking in the streets, someone would shout a racial slur at my mom, in the traffic. Some random person would just shout something out, and my mom would smile and she would say it back to them, and it was the craziest thing I'd ever seen, because as a kid I didn't understand what was going on. I was like, did you not hear what they said? And then my mom said to me, no. She said, no, how can they spoil my day? Because they said something, now I must feel a certain way? No. She said, you have no power over me. I said, no. She said, I will fight you, and I acknowledge that you are oppressing me, but I'm not going to let you spoil my day. She goes, I'm having a wonderful day, I'm walking, the sun is shining, and now because you say something, I must feel. So she would throw it right back in their face, and with a smile, someone would shout something to be like, oh, you bloody monkey, and she'd be like, oh, God bless you, God bless you, and she'd be like, yes, oh, my monkey brother, God bless you. And you could see people didn't know what to do, because the whole point of hatred is to inflict pain. If the person interprets it as love and sends it back to you, what do you now do? And that was how my mom approached life. She went, the bitterness that you hold, you are the only one who holds it. You experience it. So if you are bitter at this place that is oppressing you, at the system that is oppressing you, what's happening with that bitterness? It's not helping. It's not doing anything. You are the one who sits with it in your life, in your heart, in your home. But my mom was like, no, we're going to be happy, and we're going to be, we're going to be smiling. And then when we go out there, we fight. And then when we come home, we live our lives. And that was my thing. I think one of the biggest gifts my mom gave me was also, she never made me feel sorry for myself. I didn't think we were poor. I just thought we were black, which oftentimes means the same thing, but it didn't make me feel that I was in a situation. I felt like this was just a life. Everyone around me was living the same life. Everyone around me was poor. Everyone around me was eating what they could when they could. Everybody around me was going through the same things in different ways. So there was no point where I felt like I was having a woe is me experience. I was just going, this is life, it's not great.